How did Dunlap Cannon, a successful professional, steal millions of dollars without getting caught?
If I was an auditor, I would beware of any person who is in a position of trust, because the only people that can defraud you are people that you trust.
FMN, sponsored by the Financial Executives Institute and the Institute of Management Accountants.
Now for this month's program. In our first segment, a convicted white-collar criminal tells his story of crime and punishment. Fraud and abuse cost the U.S. economy $400 billion a year. It ranges from an employee taking a pad of paper home from work when it's against company policy to cases like that of Nick Leeson, who single-handedly bankrupted Barings Bank, Britain's oldest merchant bank. In this segment, we look at fraud from the perspective of the white-collar criminal. You'll hear the story of Dunlap Cannon told by Mr. Cannon himself. You'll learn why he did it, how he did it, and what could have been done to prevent this multi-million-dollar fraud.
Originally, from 1970 to 1994, I was a real estate attorney in Memphis. I was a sole practitioner and had a very successful practice. I did about 150 real estate closings a month and was involved in a lot of related businesses. I owned a mortgage company and a title company and part of 2 real estate companies. And I was also involved in a lot of other ventures that eventually led to my downfall. But mainly and primarily, I'm an ex-convict. I was released by the Bureau of Prisons 10 months ago, and I have 5 years of supervised release. So what I am now is not what I intended to be when I started out. I stole millions of dollars from my escrow accounts to support investments in businesses that I knew nothing about. I had been successful at a young age and pretty lucky in my law practice, and everything I touched turned to gold, so I thought I could touch everything. And what I did was initially borrow. We always say borrow because it's always your intention to pay it back most of the time when you start out. Some money from my escrow account to cover a margin call. And it evolved into a much more serious problem. Ultimately, I was charged with mail fraud, wire fraud, bank fraud, and embezzlement of government funds. The embezzlement part came because I was the attorney for HUD, and some of their money got caught up with some of my money when I went under. That's a difficult question. After spending almost 3 years in prison, you would think with all that time for introspection I would have figured it out. Initially, I was just going to borrow some money to cover a problem. But really there were, as I found out later, darker reasons for what I did. Greed, a desire to outdo my father, to look smart with money, probably all of those, and addictive personality. I say addictive not in the terms of drugs or alcohol, but in a win at all cost type personality, which apparently I've had for a good bit of my life, and trying to deal with that now. It was amazingly simple. Although when I started out at it, I was very bad because I didn't know how to do it very well, but I got much better. Initially, I used some of the float in my escrow account. And to explain that, when you're doing a lot of real estate closings, money from the closings comes in the day of closing, but the money is being dispersed over the next few days after closing. So there is some dead time between the time the money is deposited in your account and the time it all comes back to clear the bank. That creates a float in your account. And in my account, there was always a float of $1 million or more. So initially, when I borrowed $25,000 or $50,000, whatever it was, to cover a margin call, I looked at it as really a loan. I would just pay it back out of closings, I wasn't going to hurt anyone, and but as usually happens when you're in businesses that you don't belong in and you have losses, you start to double up to catch up. Before long, the problem was $500,000, and then it was $1 million, and then I was getting in more dangerous businesses, and the float disappeared. So now the $1 million is gone, I had to create float. And the way I did that was when I closed a house, to give you an example, say it was a $100,000 house. In a typical situation, people would come to closing, the seller would get his equity, which would maybe be $15,000 or $20,000. The real estate agent would get his $5,000 commission, and there'd still be $75,000 that was to be used to pay off the seller's old mortgage. I would just drag my feet for a couple of weeks before I mailed off that payoff. There's no one at a real estate closing to collect for the old mortgage company. They don't even know when somebody has sold their house or when they're going to get paid off. So it was really not that hard to do. I just drug my feet on a few payoffs. And so by doing that, if you drag your feet on 10 payoffs, all of a sudden you've got another $1 million in float sitting there that you can use. It gets dangerous when you go from 5 or 10 payoffs to 50 payoffs, because then you have a lot of people wondering what's going on, and you have to juggle a lot of balls, and you have to get more and more creative. And so I had to start kiting checks and swapping checks and anything I could to keep money in the account. I mean, we would even mail the check to the wrong address or make the check out for the wrong amount. I say we. I did all this myself. I had 10 assistants in my office, but I was the only attorney, and I take the responsibility for all of it. And I should add at this point, there's no pride in being here. I'm not here to brag about what I did. There's always a shame factor, and it comes up every time you do a lecture or a seminar or anything else. And all the money I get paid for seminars all goes to the victims of my crimes, which is not to pat myself on the back. It's the way the federal government wants it to be, and should be. Whenever you steal money from someone or borrow it or defraud them, ultimately they're going to find out unless you take care of the problem. So as in a Ponzi scheme where you get money from back-end investors to pay the front-end investors a huge return, in essence I was doing the same thing. I was not paying off the loan on people's houses, and but after 2 or 3 weeks, that's about as far as you can go, because the seller's going to start getting delinquent notices about why didn't you pay your next monthly payment. So there's not a lot of time in between there. So I would have to steal from the next sellers in order to pay off the loan of the first sellers. And my bank assisted me in this, albeit somewhat unknowingly, by allowing me to cover overdrafts from the previous day with today's deposits. In other words, lots of mornings I would call the bank, usually at 8:35, and say, how's my account look? And they would say, well, you're overdrawn $350,000. Or we have checks here for $350,000 more than your deposits. I would say, no problem, we'll bring the deposits down in a minute. Some of those were afternoon closings. We don't have the check from the mortgage company yet. Whatever excuse or lie was available. And I would bring the deposits in, and the bank would give me credit that day for those deposits, even though the checks I was putting in were from mortgage companies and on out-of-town banks. But the banker was a nice fellow, and my wife's uncle owned the bank, and I hired my banker's wife to be my in-house accountant, so I had a situation where I could manipulate getting what I wanted. Although I didn't start out to do that, it just evolved into that. And the Ponzi scheme, though, was paying off the front-end people with the new people you defraud. And as it gets bigger and your losses mount, you have to get more and more creative. First of all, in any fraud situation, you have what they call the triangle of fraud. You have a need, which is always the trigger of the fraud. And in my case, I needed some money to cover a margin call, which is related to a greed factor, obviously, of making more money, trying to make more money than I need to make. You have to have opportunity. which means a low probability of being caught. And in my case, the money was just sitting in the account. Nobody was going to audit me. Who was going to know? And 3, you have to be able to rationalize your act. Initially, you tell yourself things like, I'm not hurting anybody, it's to protect everybody, it's to protect my family, but really what you're trying to do is cover your backside. You're trying to protect yourself, but your ability to rationalize, takes over. And the more you do it, the more mythical the proportions are of your ability to rationalize. I'm saving my family, I'm saving all these employees, look what I'm doing for them. But it's all a mental ruse of sorts. You're just deceiving yourself. The key elements of a typical defrauder, number 1, is they must have a bulletproof image. This is key. This is probably number 1 on my list of elements of a defrauder. You have to have high-profile clients. I represent HUD, the mayor of Memphis, almost every bank and mortgage company in Memphis. You have to look successful. I had all the toys. I lived in a 10,000 square foot house. I had a $6,500 monthly note on my first mortgage payment. I had the cars, the boats, the lake houses, all the toys. And I threw a Christmas party each year for 5,000 people. I looked successful. Actually, I didn't make enough money to pay for those things, but the image was critical. You have to have that so that people will believe that you don't have a problem. So when a problem does arise, they can say, oh, well, he's probably right. It's probably just, something went wrong in the system because look at this guy. Why would he do something like that when he has all this going for him? And second thing is you have to say plausible things. You have to be able to give plausible excuses. And the reason they're plausible is because there is an element of truth, a half-truth in them. And most of the time when you're being audited, the people who are auditing you don't know your business better than you do. And because of that, you can say plausible things to them. And which brings us to the controller of information. In most audit situations, the defrauder, if he's on his toes, will have the information that the auditors need before they get there. He will lead them away from the problem, as I did. I had the mortgage company files. I had all the checks for those files. I was not going to let them in my escrow account, but I was going to have everything there for them. I was going to charm them, another element of a defrauder. I was going to make them trust me and make them believe what I was telling them. And in most cases, the auditors wanted to believe me. I was the biggest client of the title insurance company. I was probably the most visible real estate attorney in Memphis. The Bar Association didn't want to see me have a problem. The title company didn't. The bank surely didn't. My wife's uncle owned it. And HUD certainly didn't because they picked me to be their attorney. So when the people come in to audit you and you're able to lead them away from the problem, there's really a relief factor. And they want to know that there's not a problem, and they want to believe